This summer dress took me almost 2 years to sew. This summer dress took me so long to sew that I missed summer. Roll back to the past, and my dad, who had retired a few years earlier, decided it was finally time to clear out his wardrobe. He had a ton of shirts that he no longer had a use for, but on inspection, half of them were not suitable for the charity shop. They had frays, yellowing collars, or just looked worn and undesirable. I got the bright idea that it would be cool to try and recycle all this fabric and try and make a patchwork dress from it. I love reusing fabrics and finding another use for them. It's free and it's great for the environment. Of course, I knew creating the fabric would add a lot of extra work, but I did not anticipate just how much. I had so many shirts, and thankfully they were all pretty much the same tone and colour scheme. They were in a really high quality cotton, and enough of them to have some flexible options on the style of dress. To begin, I had to first strip down the shirts to get all the usable sections off them. This included taking off the buttons to reuse on other projects. When removing buttons like this, it's best to try and store them in their sets, so that you can easily find them later and they all match up. To store mine easily and quickly, I use safety pins. Simply thread the buttons onto a large safety pin and then close it up. You can stick them in a jar, and looking through them isn't hard work. The other trick I like to use is when you have a set off a shirt like this. It's common to have smaller buttons on the collar or cuffs. I like to attach these on a separate smaller safety pin, hook this on the larger one, and then it's all together still. I buy a box of mixed sizes like this, and then you can reuse them again and again. I'll put the link below. Each shirt was a slightly different construction, and that meant the size of the fabric I could cut from them was different. I began by reducing them down to the main flat sections, removing darts and seams. So I got each sleeve, majority of the back, and the 2 front bodice parts. I also made sure to save any special little fabrics like this where it was on the inside of the cuff. At this point, I didn't really have a plan of my end dress, so I wanted to keep my options open. I wanted a patchwork dress that still had some order to it, not completely mismatched. I took all the now flat fabric panels and cut them up into as many strips as I could of 2 different widths. First 6.5 inch and then 3 inch. I cut each shirt to maximise the strips I got off it, but one thing I did also try and ensure is that if I had a pattern on the fabric that was directional, that I had a mix. So for example, a horizontal striped shirt I cut to have both vertical and horizontal striped strips from it. So I cut and I cut and I cut, and did I tell you how much I detest using a rotary cutter? Because I really do, and I avoid it unless it's the neatest option for the project, and this turned out to be hours of roller cutting. I listened to so many audiobooks here. To break up the tedium, I tended to hack up a shirt in and around other projects I had going. If I got a spare 30 minutes before leaving for work, I just chipped away at the pile. By the time I'd cut everything, it was approaching the latter end of August, and we were approaching the tail end of a very wet and cold British summer. I knew I wasn't going to wear this dress till next year, so there was no rush to finish it. I did sew in the time between I was working on this dress, but it was for projects that I wasn't able to film. I also took the winter to redecorate and reorganise my sewing room, which I hated how it turned out, and redid it all over again. If anyone is thinking of doing a patchwork project, I don't want you to think it would take this long. It was my life getting in the way of me sewing that delayed this project so much. Please don't be discouraged. By the time I picked up this project again, it was closer to the next summer than the original. At this point, I played with the strips, laying them all out in different combinations to see how they looked together. I took the decision here to remove the completely black and white strips because I felt they were throwing the balance out of the colour scheme. I tried a combination of all wide, all small and a variation of the two. I was happy with both looks, but I still hadn't decided on a final project, so to progress I made 2 continuous long strips from the 2 widths. The hardest part here was ensuring I have a mixture of all the patterns running through the strips, without creating an order with them. I had different amounts of each pattern and I didn't want to end up with a repeat on my end dress. I wanted it to look randomly placed. Each section was sewn together on the shortest edge using a 1 cm seam allowance. I finished each raw edge with the overlocker together to prevent it fraying, and then I pressed the raw edge to the darkest side of the 2 adjoining pieces. I also spent approximately half a decade cutting off threads, and I found it was quicker to work in big long batches like this than seam by seam. At this point, I had to pick my dress design to go forward. I wanted a casual dress as the patchwork was busy, so I felt the dress needed to be quite simple in design to let it shine. In the end, I decided on a dress I've made a few times that I get a lot of wear of. The Maya Sotis dress by Deer and Doe Patterns. Given the amount of work I'd done, the last thing I wanted was to make a dress that I didn't enjoy wearing and waste my work. So this felt like a safe bet, and my previous version of it was beginning to look washed out in colour. I got the pattern pieces out that I would need, and I used the bodice part to determine how I would lay out my strips. The height of the bodice was not that many strips of my wide fabric, so I ruled out using just them alone, as I thought you would lose the effect of the patchwork if you only had 2 or 3 patches on it. At first I considered if I needed to do my upper body in the thin strips and the lower portion in the wide, but when I lay that out it didn't feel balanced either. So after much fussing around, I decided to combine small and wide strips. I approached this thinking I would not do them alternate, but that's what I ended up with in the end, with some trial and error. To attach the strips side by side, I simply aligned them and sewed the long edges together until I reached a point that the same fabric patterns were going to be attached to each other. I didn't want them to fall side by side at any point if I could help it. I managed to get a decent run, which was long enough to allow me to easily cut out my bodice sections and sleeves with plenty of room for the pattern matching. So I used this length and started adding the next strip in the same technique. I found this project involved a lot of indecision as I went along, and maybe that's why it took me so long to make. I had no clear idea of what I wanted at the end, which was fun to be creative with, but also made me more cautious to not just do something that I would regret down the line when I went a different direction. Each strip was added, and as I went, I checked how it looked with the pattern. I did have to stop a few times and cut out a section from my wide or thin strip. I didn't plan this, I just noticed that when I was reaching a part where 2 matching patterns were going to run alongside each other, I stopped. I then cut away the problem section and then connected it back up with the next one on the line. Or in this case here, I added a short section I had previously cut away into the gap. Obviously, each time I had to finish and press the edges where the joins were made before I could continue joining my strips again. Another thing you really had to watch for was that you made sure the raw edges were caught in the same direction on both sides of the strips. It wasn't really important if they went left or right, so long as they went the same direction at the top and the bottom. A lot of this project was double checking things were consistent on the wrong side so that the right side looked as neat as possible. I finished each edge with the overlocker and pressed them once again. At this point you could get more of a feel of what it would look like. The skirt sections, I actually connected my strips to size. So for the bodice, I could have done this same method and deliberately laid out my strips over the paper pattern to fill the area, join them up and know my fabric patterns were nice and balanced and being happy. There probably would have been less wasted fabric. I only did this for the skirt as it was 2 rectangles. I measured the pattern width and cut strips equal to the size of both my skirt sections. The reason I did both together is that I then could guarantee they would match up going round in a circle later on. Each time I watched for the same errors as before, which was not aligning matching fabrics, ensuring my raw edges faced the same direction. I just kept going till I was down to the length I needed. I cut out the bodice front first and I had to really think about placement. First, I wanted the stripes to look visually appealing. I didn't want to lose the patchwork effect by placing the thin stripes so that they were cut off or barely visible, and it ended up looking more of a blockwork dress than a patchwork dress. But I had to think about the construction of the dress at the same time. Each of the seams of the patchwork were bulky and firm compared to a regular flat fabric. I needed to ensure I didn't place any crucial dart points or buttons or collar sections at the same point that these seams lay. I needed to work with them. The other thing with the darts to consider is that the fabric is folded away from view, meaning this much fabric isn't visible at the side seam. I didn't want my thin strips to fall in this section and completely disappear. Once I felt I had a good spot, I cut my back bodice on the fold. I then transferred all my markings before using this to match my strips for the other side. Using the back bodice to line up the stripes so it was a continuous round as best I could, allotting for the darts at the front. Using the back bodice to line up the stripes so it was continuous round as best I could, allotting for the darts at the front. The front bodice has a dart on the side seam where the fabric will not show fully on the end dress. I had to decide here to align my fabric to match below or above this dart. This was how I decided how to place my pencil line on the paper pattern to help align the next piece. Always remember to check your grain lines as you go when doing stuff like this. With the vertical placement set, I then had to figure out the fabric choices I wanted visible in my bodice front left. I made sure I didn't have any dominant fabrics from the back bodice repeated in the front, or that no singular fabric was shown more. I used the cut front bodice and turned it over to place my second front. Again, I needed to consider the fabric patterns that would be on this part. I didn't really want a repeat of my first side's fabric, but I needed to ensure that they married up enough that they didn't look like two different dresses. I also needed to think about not wasting too much of the fabric pattern matching, and then not having enough to complete the rest of the dress. There was a lot to think about. I cut the collar from a wide strip I had cut out whilst joining my strips up, and made sure it was a fabric that didn't clash with any of the patterns that had ended up at the top of my bodice sections. At this point, I didn't actually cut out the sleeves. I couldn't decide if I wanted to place the strips in a different direction, so I put the spare fabric aside to decide later when the rest of the dress was complete. Cutting the skirt was straightforward given how I'd constructed the patchwork to size. All I had to do was level out the edges and then cut it in half to get my front and back. I won't go through making this dress step by step, as this is not my pattern and it isn't for me to share. I do highly recommend this pattern though. The instructions are really good. I will talk here about the changes I made to it and things I had to do to work with the patchwork. First up was the darts. My calculations earlier were right, and I didn't end up with any seams on important parts of the darts, but this part felt tense. I had to work with my seams at this point when pressing my darts. The pattern called for them to be pressed towards the waist sides, but the fabric naturally wanted to lie in a certain direction because of the position of the seams. Forcing it to lie against the resisting direction was unwise, so I had to study the darts as I went. Luckily, I was able to match the darts on the left and right in the same pressing direction. It wouldn't be that much of a problem if you had the left pressed in and the right pressed out, but it's better to match if you can. If you are planning a patchwork project of your own, definitely allow yourself surplus fabric for if you come across problems like this and have to recut. You can't always anticipate where you'll get tripped up when you're constructing during the cutting stage, especially if it's a pattern you haven't made before. I added waist ties, which I made out of the thin strips. I joined them down the long edge, turned them the right way, and attached them at the bodice side seams just above the seam allowance distance. Again, I had to constantly check the directions of the raw seams as I pinned things up. You could not just follow the pattern guidance or decide as you went. You had to make sure they married up through the full length of the seams and weren't going to get in the way of a button later on, for example. I actually got lucky and I only had to unpick once to flip a raw seam from upwards to down. any parts of the dress that were on the inside and not visible, I used the white shirt fabric I removed at the beginning, so that worked out great. The collar, I intentionally made sure there was no seams in it. I felt this gave it a need to finish. I also used some of the buttons I'd cut off the original shirt's hair. This was a complete recycle. The skirt was straightforward, just matching up the stripes on the side seams. This dress has pockets, which I think is essential. I also made sure that the fabric patterns on the top layer balance with the fabric patterns on the bottom layer of the bodice for both the front and back before I began. This whole top edge does get gathered down a lot, but I still aim for no matches. You can see how the fabric patterns loop from front to back seamlessly. The sleeves I now went back to. I laid out the skirt and bodice and tried both vertical and horizontal. It was an instant dislike for the vertical to me, so I cut them out, not really too fussed about matching fabrics on the shoulder seams, as this is such a direction change I didn't think it was that obvious. All I made sure here was that you got a nice stripe running through it and the two sleeves matched. Inserting these sleeves was much slower than usual. There was plenty of seams to affect the gathers. Then you had to match the seam directions. There was a lot of pins involved. The bodice and skirt were attached together, gathering it in. It was surprising just how much extra bulk and weight it felt, making this simply adding the patchwork feature and seams. It gave the skirt a lot more volume, which I quite liked. The raw seams were overlocked to finish, and then I spent some time snipping away any leftover threads I'd missed. At this point, I made a decision on whether to include the bottom ruffle. In the pattern, it's a wider ruffle, but I had already added length into the skirt, so I decided to just use a single wide strip as the ruffle and take it from there. I didn't want to join strips and make it look busier and bottom heavy. To create the ruffle, I measured the length of fabric I would need and cut it directly from the strip. I hemmed the bottom edge before gathering it to the bottom edge of my skirt. The final dress looked like this. Despite how long it took me to complete this dress, I don't actually think I did that much extra sewing time. The work was in the cutting at the beginning, but I found that worse as I really hate rotary cutting, but it was the best option here. I'm pleased with how it turned out, and I'm even more pleased all these shirts were saved from landfill. I do have some fabric strips left over, which I'm going to store for now. I don't think I will ever go into quilting, but I wouldn't rule it out completely. There was something satisfying about using up them smaller leftover fabrics and also create something with a little more of a kick to it than just bought pattern fabric. If you have enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up to help others find it. I create sewing tutorials, patterns and project content like today for people to enjoy. If that sounds like your thing, consider giving me a subscribe. Till next time, happy sewing.